Welcome. I'm Al Gaylor, Extension Educator in Sandusky County, joined by Jason Hartshoe from Crawford County, and behind the camera Mike Gasteyer in Huron County. And we've been collaborating for a couple of years now on some annual forage projects and trials to just kind of help farmers figure out what they might be able to do for additional feed and utilize some of that idle ground, especially where we had wheat growing, or in the case of 2019 where we had nothing growing and a lot of idle acres from prevented plant. So this project started last summer officially with a lot of different species that we utilized on that idle ground once we got the designation that we could grow annual forages for harvest on prevented plant acres. And throughout my career, I've done a lot of different research with oats, rye, triticale, and some other annual species to try to figure out a better way to feed beef cattle into the summer, or to the end of summer, into fall and winter with extended season grazing. Here in the northern part of the state, most of that is not a grazing situation, it's more of a harvested feed. So a lot of the stuff will be put into wet wrap bales or green chopped, or in some cases even dry baled. But what our goal is here with these extension projects is to try to figure out more economical ways to feed our livestock and get some additional income off of otherwise idle ground, which will also benefit in weed control, soil health, and numerous other factors. So what we're going to do is walk you through our plot here today that was planted on July 17th into wheat ground. The wheat was harvested right around July 4th. And we came in on the 17th then with a grain drill to plant all these different species. And what we're trying to do is study ideal planting dates, seeding rates, and then figure out optimal timing for harvest to match maximum tonnage with overall quality. And we will be running nutrient samples on all of these feedstuffs as we harvest them here later this fall. So I'm going to let Jason talk to you a little bit about what each species is and planting rates that we applied here in this particular field.
All right, thanks Al. Al had mentioned the 2019 study. If you have interest in that, that was actually published in the eFields booklet and also online with an in-depth analysis of all the forage cover crop species we had in 2019. It's available in eFields. It's very interesting. From that we picked out probably the 5. They're the most common, but they were also the most economical and beneficial crops that we could take as a harvested forage. Some of the others, maybe you could graze, but weren't going to be economical to harvest, or were going to be challenging to harvest because you at least have to get them, dried down to that 40-50% in order to wet wrap them as a bale. If you're making haylage or silage out of them, you can do that 60-70% on a lot of these, but making them as baled and wrapped hay, we need them down that 50% or so, and some of them we just really can't get them that dry. So the first crop we have here in this study is oats. We can typically plant oats. This is actually a little bit earlier. A lot of times we'll wait until about the 1st of August to plant the oats, but in an equal comparison of planting date and the same management across all of these, we planted this oats in mid-July. A lot of times we can plant it about through the 15th of August. After that, it isn't quite as economical to plant. To try to bale, we could maybe graze it. But this oats was planted at 100 pounds to the acre. Oats, right here we're still working on getting out. The flag leaf's just starting to come out on this oats. When that flag leaf is fully out, that's when we hit maximum quality and we can actually use oats as dairy feed. If we make it at that flag leaf, it's just emerging. We've seen oats come in 18-20% crude protein, very high digestibility. As that head emerges, we can still have really good quality. Some of the work from last year showed the little bit later planted oats maintained quality better after it put on a head, and we'd still see protein anywhere from about 12-15% after that head emerges. One challenge we do have in oats is it has some issues with crown rust. We see a lot of crown rust in this fall planted oats, but we have found that we can use a fungicide to control that crown rust very effectively. It does seem to decrease palatability a little bit, and we see a decrease in energy when we run a forage analysis due to that crown rust. But overall, oats is probably our main staple for a lot of our cattle producers coming in after wheat. It grows very well year in and year out. With a little bit later planting date, we seem to hit the moisture better than some of these other crops. It's also a little bit easier to bale and harvest as wet wrapped hay, which most of our beef producers are set up to do. Whereas a lot of our dairy producers will look at some of these other species we have in this plot today. So moving into our next species that we planted, a lot of people wouldn't think about planting this as a late crop. This is actually corn. So we planted corn with our grain drill, and we planted it in that 8-inch row, and we put on the 100 pounds of nitrogen that Al had mentioned earlier. And the corn did really well for us last year. This year we had a little bit more emergence problems with the corn. I would say if you're going to plant corn, I would recommend still using your corn planter just for that little bit better seed to soil contact. Corn's kind of a challenging crop. If you don't get really good seed soil contact, get it planted at that 2-inch depth or better when it's going into late season like this and getting dry. But our goal with this corn is going to be, we're going to grow it, but we're not going to chop it like corn size. We're really not looking for an ear to develop on these corn plants. So by planting them in late July, if we have adequate moisture, last year we saw really good yields. It was actually our top yielder. We were seeing about 15 tons of corn silage, so that's wet weight. Worked out to I think 6 or 7 tons of dry matter on the corn silage. So it was our highest yielding crop. And just as that tassel started to emerge is when we want to harvest this corn. That's typically 60 to not quite 90 days after planting. We'll start getting the tassel emergence on this corn, and that's going to be when we want to harvest it, because we don't want it to try to put on an ear. Before it puts on that ear, it has the most energy and crude protein in the stalks. And we seeded this corn at about 70,000 seeds to the acre, so we went a little bit higher on that seeding rate because we're in these narrow rows. We're not really looking for tassel ear development. We're looking for maximum plant fodder content, so maximum silage yield. We look down that way. We have a little bit better stand. This spot right here that I moved into, we have a good stand on this side, not quite as good on that side. So I think planting with a corn planter would probably get us a little bit better stand. But I think we got some pretty good yield potential here in this corn if we get a couple rains here over the next few weeks. All right, now we've moved into sorghum Sudan, Sudex. It's a Sudex variety. It's actually a brown midrib. If you look really close here, you can see, I didn't pick the best leaf, but we have a brown midrib to it. It's a brown midrib variety, increased digestibility, lower lignin content, a little bit better feed, especially if you're looking to chop this for dairy forage. So you can see this crop does better. This summer's been dry. They've had a little bit better rain right here where we're at than in other parts of the state, but you can see this crop is doing fairly well. It likes this drier weather. That's why it's a chosen favorite by a lot of dairy farmers to put in after wheat. Is it can actually thrive if we don't get rain. We just need a few tenths to get it to germinate. It'll take off and grow. Fairly high digestibility and high protein content, energy. Not quite, a little bit higher protein than corn silage, but a little bit lower energy. So it can be mixed into heifer or dairy rations. It actually makes a great feed to put beef cows on right around calving time. That higher energy, higher protein helps increase milk production to get those calves off and growing. You may not want to feed this as a pure crop in the round bale feeder. Mid-gestation, it won't hurt anything. You just may be providing a little bit more energy than you need, but it'd definitely be a great crop to harvest and put in with some of that low-quality first cutting hay. If we mix this in with some low-quality first cutting hay made properly, we can pretty much make a forage ration for a beef cow, brood cow diet during gestation. You notice here it's almost chest high. So this crop, anywhere from 45 to 60 days, we'd look at coming in here and actually taking 2 cuttings probably off of it. That's one of the benefits of it. You won't get quite the same yield I talked about in corn silage, where we may get up to 7 or 8 tons of dry matter. I forgot to mention over in the oats, dry matter yield on the oats tends to range from 1 to 2 tons. Some years we'll do really well and see slightly over that 2 ton of dry matter. This year we're going to be looking at, for dry matter, probably 6 tons of dry matter. It's kind of strange to think about it in that fashion because most of us harvest it as a wet forage. So a lot of times you'll see 15 tons of harvestable tonnage coming off of this, off of 2 cuttings. So at 45 to 60 days, we're going to cut it 4 to 6 inches depending where that growing point is. Come in, mow it, wilt it, and then bale it or chop it, and then it's actually going to grow back. And we'll have just enough time to get that second cutting off before we have that first frost. If it does freeze and gets frost killed, we can still harvest it. We just have to watch for some nitrates and prussic acids. So a lot of times you just don't want to graze it, but we can make it as either typically wet hay or silage at that time. Let it in sile, and a lot of those nitrate concerns would go away. You may still want to have it tested. That's not a bad plan. But this here seems to make an excellent crop. It's a small leaf, a small stalk. These smaller stalks and leaves make it a lot better to put into that round bale feeder. than when we look at the sorghum here in just a little bit. Usually we also don't get, right there's a corn plant. You can see that smaller stalk and smaller leaf. If you're not going to chop it up at all, the smaller plant's easier for the cow to digest and she won't waste as much. Where these corn stalks, she'd grab the whole stalk and pull it out if it was in a round bale feeder. And the next crop we're going to move into, a lot of people don't think about this as a forage crop, but soybeans. This here is actually a forage soybean type. You can see it's actually not doing as well as that sorghum sudex over there that we were just in. It's been a little bit too dry for these soybeans. One nice thing about the soybean is we can clean up the volunteer weed in it. After that soybean's planted, we could come in, we could use a Roundup Ready soybean. If we use a forage type soybean, typically they bush out more, so that's why we lean towards that forage soybean. They're also a very high protein crop. But the soybean needs a little bit more water than our sorghum sedans or our straight sorghums or sudexes. So it's struggling a little bit more here than what any of our grass crops are. But if we know we're going to have a lot of volunteer wheat, this broadleaf soybean is great because we can come in with, if it's a generic forage soybean, you kind of cleft it in a grass herbicide and we can clean this weed up. The soybeans, they're going to be that high protein. We've seen soybeans come in 20-24% crude protein, but we want to make soybeans, they're going to be a late harvest. We don't have any flowers on these beans yet. We will eventually get flowers, and then basically when we're done flowering is when we want to harvest soybeans. We want to make sure we harvest them right at or before we get skin on the actual bean. So when we get skin on the bean, the oil content really starts to go up, and that could cause some problems in our rations. But typically it's high enough in crude protein. We're going to blend it with some other grass crops for most of our cattle, or mix it in a silage for dairy or heifers, so we don't have a lot of oil problems, but that could be a concern. And moving in here to our last species that we're going to discuss today, we have straight forage sorghum. It's a BMR variety again. It has that brown midrib, so we know it's a BMR. It's higher digestibility. I mentioned when we were over in the sudex, that smaller plant, so this one here, a little bit thicker stem than the sudex, but thinner than what the corn was. You could round bale this and feed it as a round bale. It's really better off though if it gets at least cut in the baler or put in a mixer wagon and chopped up a little bit smaller particles, better for digestion. This crop's another one we could harvest twice. If you're going to make round bales off of it, 45 to 60 days, you're probably going to want to mow it, wilt it, and bale it. You'll end up with a little bit smaller plant. Or if you're looking to make this as silage and to chop it, you would have the option of letting it go. It may put on a seed head, which is fine, but actually letting it go probably into November so it doesn't frost kill if you got a nice canopy until most years in Ohio, early to mid-November. And then we'll go in and actually cut it with the Kemper head, the same head you use on a large self-propelled chopper or some of the smaller choppers with the rotating heads, and we could straight cut it at that time. Sometimes you have to let it get the first frost to get it dry enough, and as long as you ensile it, we haven't seen a lot of nitrate and prussic acid problems. Again, after it's frosted, we really don't want to use this crop for grazing right away. We have to give it a little bit of time. All these species could also be grazed. We see a few producers, if they're having pasture problems, they'll take some of these summer annuals that do well in the heat of summer compared to our typical cool season pastures, and they'll plant these summer annuals and they'll actually graze these throughout the summer. It can work quite well to use them that way instead of as a double crop after wheat. Some producers will also plant them as their primary crop in early June instead of mid-July, and typically when they do that, they're looking for 2 cuttings off of them. They're going to mow them, make a cutting, let them regrow. But they can make really good feeds and alternatives to corn. If you're having an alfalfa shortage that year, you can plant these on some of your hay acres. If you have a hay field that's just not producing, you can go in and kind of fill in and bring that field back to life so you get tonnage for that year until you have time to plant a new seeding. So those are the species that we have here today. We actually planted one other one, Teff grass, which some years does really good. Other years we struggle with Teff, and this year was not the year for Teff, at least not in this field. Talking to a few other producers, one had great luck, planted Teff, and it's growing for him this year. The next one had a Teff failure. It has to be planted very shallow, and it likes a little bit more moisture than what some of these sorghums and sedans and things we planted today prefer.
In this part of the world, Jason, in Ottawa County, though, Teff is an attractive feature as we are in the heart of hay production country right here on these heavy lake bed clay soils. And Teff is a crop because most of the guys around here, there's very little livestock. Most guys are in dry hay production situations. So if you're thinking annual forages and you are not equipped with large bales or any type of wrapping or chopping system, and you're looking to do dry hay on those annual forages, Teff is a good option, and you may want to try to experiment with it. It may take some experience and some practice to be able to learn how to grow and manage Teff, but we can also expect 2 good cuttings. Last year was the year for Teff, and a lot of guys had really good luck with significant tonnages off of both first and second cuttings, even though they had to wait until September to do so. So definitely a viable option. Oats is another one that when we're looking at that dry hay situation, I grow a lot of oats on my own farm for my own beef cow production, and about once every 3 years in late September, early October, we get that 7 to 8 day dry spell that you can actually make dry hay off of those oats. Depending on the species you're going to try to feed and where you want to maximize your quality, letting those oats head out, which they will not try to produce grain at that point in the season, but they will shoot a false seed head, really speeds that drying process, makes those oats a much better crop for dry hay, and it is possible if you have the right patience and the tools and the management.
Yeah, that seed head on the oats is definitely not a problem this time of year. In spring oats, seed heads, you really see a quality decline. We see these oats keep pretty good quality into the fall even after it shoots that seed head. Makes excellent brood cow feed, a little bit of fiber if you're looking for it, in a finishing diet for some reason, and it makes great dairy heifer hay. So oats is definitely probably the favorite option out of all of these for many producers.
So just in a quick summary, as we stand here in Ottawa County between Oak Harbor and Genoa on our annual summer forage plot, we're going to give you a quick rundown of what we did. We planted 5 different species here. We started with oats that were planted at about 100 pounds per acre. We planted corn that was planted at about a population of 70,000. Again, this was all planted with no-till drill. We planted sorghum Sudan at population, Jason?
The sorghum Sudan would have been about 30 pounds to the acre.
We planted soybeans.
200,000 seeds to the acre on the soybeans.
And another brown midrib sorghum variety at
10 pounds to the acre.
And then, as Jason said, we did plant Teff as well, but that crop was a failure for this year. And so, in quick summary, here is some of the most viable options for your supplementing your livestock operation, or if you're looking for additional income and you have availability to sell forages. Jason, what would be, if you're going to feed beef cattle, what is probably the ideal pick and what you're going to use out of all these crops if you have, say, 1 wheat stubble field that you can utilize?
If I had 1 wheat stubble field and I was going to feed beef cattle, and I was a typical beef cattle producer in Ohio, I would pick oats, would be my choice. Oats is the simplest to manage, it's the simplest to harvest, and year in and year out, it gives you the best results. If I had a little bit larger operation, I had access to a TMR mixer wagon, even if I was feeding round bales, so I could grind them up a little bit, I would probably go with the Sudex. It's the next best option here. It's going to get you a little bit more tons, but it really needs a little bit of grinding to be able to feed that. So those would be my first 2 choices for a beef cattle diet.
And now if you were a sheep producer, Jason?
If I was a sheep producer, a lot of sheep producers are scared of oats, but I like oats for sheep also. You can feed wet wrapped oats to sheep. There's no issues with that as long as you watch for mold. As long as it's done right, wrapped soon after, and those bales are sealed well, they will ensile, and you're not going to have issues. I don't like looking at Sudex and sorghum for sheep, especially if you don't have any way to chop it up. They're really good at wasting it. That's just a really big plant.
And then where this all comes together is for the dairy producer, whether he has the land to do it himself or can work with neighbors that may have wheat stubble fields or a plan to grow forages but don't have livestock themselves. Dairy producers can certainly take advantage of all of these crops and maybe utilize them in tandem to maximize the use of that TMR mixer and formulate the best rations that they can throughout the entire season, making healthy soils, better feed for our livestock, and hopefully an economic impact on the bottom line for all of our producers.